Okay, start again. Friday, 6th of November, critical thinking. So I want to present to you the idea of diary as a mode of support for critical thinking. I use my weblog as a kind of diary, not a every day writing down what I did every day, but a notepad. And you probably use your notepads or your exercise book or whatever in a similar way. After 40 years of being an academic, 35 years as a researcher, I now have many notebooks, and they have become a huge resource, not only because my memory is going, but it is. And face it, I think that's happening to everyone because of Google, because of electronic resources. You don't have to remember everything now. You can just, as my son says, what's the best answer to any question? Look it up on Google. It's terrible, but our memory is being monetized and electrified. A weblog or a handwritten diary can be a useful tool for critical thinking. I want to make the case using Marx and Gandhi. On the anniversary of the 150th year of Mahatma Gandhi since he was born, and the 200th anniversary of Marx, his birth, 201. Let's say, romantically, I want to suggest that a diary can be, a handwritten diary can be a kind of meditation on research. It can be very conducive to self-reflection, critical thinking, but putting it down on paper, you think while you write. Let's call it a form of meditation in writing. But the way to get into this, I want to show you that great intellectuals and great figures engage in writing diary. Gandhi and Marx. Start with a quote from Vinoba Bhave, who was a follower of Gandhi, maybe his best disciple. Whatever interest the world may or may not take in the comparative study of Gandhi and Marx, in our own country, he means India, at least, it has become a subject of everyday discussion among the educated. Every discourser attempts to weigh Gandhi and Marx and measure them up according to his capacity. So Gandhi and Marx is a topic of much discussion. And let's say too much discussion as well. We might think there have been far too many wild comparisons between a man who is for non-violence and a revolutionary thinker like Marx. Between Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma means great, Maha, great soul. Mahatma Gandhi. And Karl Marx needs no preface. Any effort to even summarize their positions in terms that allow an overall evaluation, though, is nearly impossible because they're too big and too important, both. So any generalization can't be decisive. Here's a plan of what I want to do today. It seems like an impossible task. I propose instead to risk coming at it at a different angle to reclaim scholarship that surrounds the reified focus on the general and the programmatic. So I'm reading the letters and the prefaces and the peripheral apocrypha, the side texts, if you like, of both Marx, the notebooks as they're published in the Mega, the Marx and Engels Gesamtarbeit, and the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, some 100 volumes. Of course, I've not read all of them. I dare say I probably read more Marx than Gandhi. But I read a lot, and we'll get into it. Also, there is the diaries of Mahatma Gandhi, and the autobiography. Marx, unfortunately, did not write an autobiography. In fact, there's overabundance of biographies, but not from his own hand, but there are many people who knew him who wrote about him. So I'm planning to go through some categories that can be taken up: control, modern industry, dialectics, revolutionary violence, women, technology, class oppression, religion, opium, fascism, and reading. That's too many. I will go fairly quickly. And I hope you can follow on the screen because it's translated. Okay? It might not be perfect, but it'll give you a close idea. I'm going to stick fairly closely to this. So there are debates about Gandhi and Marx. And of course, any debate is conditioned by the perspective of where we are now. So we're looking from 21st century, post-Trump era, maybe post-Trump era. The talk I'm giving, the paper, will emphasize the diary as a vehicle for introspection, and letters as something that can share almost anything. Like, of course, letters are also self-censored, right? Edited in practice, but they are often ways in which we see people setting out draft ideas, preliminary sketches of what will eventually be published work. So if we can look at diaries and letters, we see how these thinkers think. Diaries, more or less, sometimes they're often written with publication in mind, of course, especially by someone famous, but more or less they're written without the intent to publish. And letters are usually meant only for the ear of the confidant, the person you're writing to, and not necessarily for public, like your emails. Except, of course, they are at the same time. Draft scripts, though, they're never scripture. What I mean here is that it's not like we're talking about something that's fixed forever. Those ideas you write down in a letter or in a diary or a notebook are subject to change even in your own writing. So we don't invoke liturgical, hermeneutical methods. The uses that we make of editing, selecting, translating, exerting, and erasing passages and paragraphs in our writing is really key. What we include and what we discard. So quite often what is in a letter or a diary is not the finished product, is not something you decide that you want to go out to public. So we're also critically thinking about our own writing. Now, we should of course also want to avoid any kind of grand theory stereotypes, like grand theory Marx, or that somehow Gandhi is just some saint or unassailable figure. Gandhi has been taken that way as a saint. Marx too, sometimes taken as someone who can't be criticized. You know, Tagore, the great Indian writer, thought of Gandhi as a saint, talked about him in ways that were a little bit hyperbolic, let's say. But Richard Attenborough, in his film, even more, in his film Gandhi, I mean, recognized the love of the Indian people and Gandhi's love for them, but also turned him into a saint through the film in some ways. Although there were critics of that film who said Gandhi cannot be represented on the screen. One actor should not represent Gandhi. Only a ball of light should represent him because he is enlightenment. Now, why Gandhi and Marx? Why read them together? Because it's what I know, because I think it's interesting, because they also are being discussed, but also because both want to change the world. So they think that the point of thinking is to change the world. Both of them have that view. Both raise in their evident sense of mission, both raise the spectre of the mass power of the oppressed, rising up and changing the imperative of collective work, collective endeavor. The people rising up in self-determination was to be a change towards an unalienated life, a future untrammeled by the evils of capital and exploitation. Gandhi and Marx are the names for a desire for freedom for some. And both work it out how to get there through their texts and practice. All right, I'm going to look at comparative. Comparative analysis is a style of analytical work. Gandhi kept a diary throughout most of his adult life. So we do have those documents. At least since his first trip to London when he was young, went to study law in London. The first volume of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, after 3 small notes, which are a confession, a graduation speech, and a letter to his mother, the first substantial text is his London diary. Later, Gandhi advised his followers, the Satyagraha. Satyagraha is the name, the Satyagrahis are the name for his devotees who committed themselves to struggle for freedom of India. He advised them to keep a diary which would be a mirror of your own mind, recording your thoughts and dreams, good and bad. The idea here is to reflect on the way you think critically and honestly. The diary is therefore not for publication. Some of the greatest diaries actually are written in code so no one can read them. Unfortunately, we worked out the code for Samuel Pepys, for example, a 16th century diarist. I'm reading at present. His diary is amazing. He wrote it in a code to himself. It tells a lot about early bourgeois culture in London at the beginning of capitalism. Okay, a prospective Satyagrahi is expected to keep a logbook or a diary, right? It's a logbook. So it's not a day-by-day thing. Although Gandhi says, daily you enter the work done in the course of the day, and the logbook is then to be submitted to him. That was for his close followers. Right? He was learning from them as well. Gandhi's own publication of his innermost diary is for public reading. But for him, politics was not split between private and public. And for him, writing diary is a form of consciousness raising. I'm sure you've come across this term before, consciousness raising. But it's come back into contemporary politics in interesting ways. With the work of Mark Fisher, for example, Plan C in England. He died a couple of years ago, but he was a very important author for the left in England, and for young people especially. He was writing a lot about consciousness raising, the necessity to examine your life critically and have that inform what you do. So writing diary is consciousness raising, an effort to increase and emphasize forms of conscious self-activity that would be a greater contribution to democratic participation than any vote box, tick box, vote on this stamp kind of activity. Look at the election in the US, for example. How many people are involved politically in that farce? Basically, it comes down to one place, one state that determines who will be the president of the United States. Well, maybe two, Pennsylvania or Georgia. That's hardly mass participation. It's hardly a path for everyone to have a say in how they live, because the amount of money spent getting those votes. In his autobiography, he wrote an autobiography quite early on. Gandhi writes about diary writing, and he says, the exercise has given me ineffable mental peace, because it's been his fond hope that it might bring faith in truth and ahisma, the search for truth, right, to someone who wavers. The idea that your diary, your logbook, your notebook, please try and follow. The idea is your, hello? So it's written in Tingviet, you can follow, right? Rather than looking on your phone. I would really appreciate that. Maybe you can ditch the phone. Hello? Chuck it. Turn it off. Your phone, please. Thank you. It's rude. I can see that you're not paying attention. And, you know, I don't do this for fun. Well, I do, but, you know. If you write every day, right, that's going to be a significant chunk of your day, but if you think of it as a way of reflecting on it and searching for your mission, your sense of what you're doing, you can agree that Gandhi's onto something. Gandhi, however, is criticized by many. He's criticized by Bipin Chandra. He said, well, you know, he did bring the masses into politics, into a political movement, and he talked about them having self-conscious activity. But he never encouraged or permitted the masses to discuss and develop political activity on their own. They were always writing their diary for him. They were always followers of him, and he called on them to mobilize when he had decided, and to stop mobilizing when he decided. But, you know, against that, he's also an advocate of not just literary, but reflexive, contemplative self-examination. This is a huge thing in India. I think elsewhere as well, but the Indians have made it into like a faith, a religion. The core idea of the Bhagavad Gita, the story about Ganesh and well, about Arjuna and Krishna going to battle, is that you spend your time, your main mission in life is to examine what it is that you're doing here. What is yourself, your inner true self, whatever that could be. So there's critics of Gandhi who say he didn't bring the people into radical democracy, and others that recognize that he spent his time doing what many Indian philosophers and religious figures, sadhus, take on as a life mission: introspection, meditation, thinking about what is thinking. That's basically critical thinking. And the reason why I want to bring it up for you today, and why I think it's worth you following, which if you're not doing, I wonder why you're here. The reason for bringing it up is that it's a form of critical thinking, like a philosophy of critical thinking, but it's outside of the Western philosophical tradition, to some extent. Of course, there are also critics of Gandhi who say that, you know, he is too influenced by Western philosophy. And he was influenced by some parts of Western philosophy, like vegetarianism from Tolstoy, and some anthropology. But really the edgy parts, not exactly Kant or Hegel or Marx for that matter. But Marx, what is the relationship of Marx and Gandhi? From my perspective, the way in which I'm approaching Gandhi through diary and letters, I think it's worth noting that we have letters from Marx, but he kept no diary. But his almost daily correspondence with Friedrich Engels is like a diary. It's an archive of the second half of the 19th century. And we can see there him and Engels working out what will be in their publications, working out their ideas in an exchange with each other. The letters have the most significant points. For example, in the letter to Arnold Rouge, which was a correspondence that he shared with Engels, Marx asserts that the task of the communist is a ruthless criticism of everything that exists. The result being unafraid of whatever the results are of that criticism. The results that it arrives at in the sense of being neither afraid of that criticism or of criticism of the powers that be, what they will say in response to that criticism if you make it. Later, in a letter, a very important letter, Marx writes to the Russian newspaper Otechevenia Zapitsky. He points out that the journal should not understand his capital as a blueprint. Don't allow the writers in that journal to turn his capital, to metamorphose his historical sketch of the genesis of capital in Western Europe into some historical philosophical theory of the general march imposed as if by fate on all people, whatever their historical circumstances. Now, unfortunately, that's what many people did. Took Marx's model of the development of capitalism in Western Europe as a blueprint for how things will happen everywhere. And he was already, very soon after, 10 years after its publication, saying, no, don't distort my work. Don't distort it into a blueprint. What it is a teaching tool for you to make your own analysis. Now, some Marxists do also follow that. Of course, everything he had said has a follower somewhere. The historical sketch only shows the process in Europe. It, quote, describes a historical movement by which, by divorcing the producers from their means of production, converts them into wage earners, proletarians in the modern sense of the word. We can see that happening all over the world, it's true, in many circumstances, but how that happens is different in each country. Well, It's pretty common how it happened under colonialism in different places. Yes, French colonialism was different to English colonialism, but the process of expropriation was very similar. Another of Marx's letters, he writes to his daughter, is fantastic. In the second last year of his life, he's moved to Algeria, and he signs off a letter to his daughter Laura with an Orientalist parable. I've not traced where he got this story from, but I'm sure the Mahatma would have loved it. Marx writes, "A ferryman is ready and waiting with a small boat on the tempestuous waters of the river. A philosopher, wishing to get to the other side of the river, climbs into the boat. Then they have the following dialogue. The philosopher, do you know anything from history, ferryman? The ferryman, no. The philosopher, then you've wasted half your life. And again, the philosopher, have you studied mathematics? The ferryman, no, no mathematics. The philosopher, then you've wasted more than half your life. Hardly were these words out of the philosopher's mouth when the wind capsized the boat, throwing the ferryman and the philosopher in the water, whereupon the ferryman shouts, can you swim? The philosopher says, no. The ferryman says, then you've wasted your whole life. Mark's having a bit of fun with his daughter, right? I suspect this parable, he's picked up from an Arabic story somewhere, right? So this is Marx, right? Marx, who we're taught is boring and dull and just all economics. No, he's fun if you get into the letters. All right, I want to talk about concepts in both Marx and Gandhi. Gandhi and Marx both instinctively appealed to the same idea in their critical thinking, the concept of an unalienated life. Like Gandhi, Marx stressed one of the objectification of the relations between nature and human beings is such that nature is not seen any longer as prompting political and moral engagement, living in nature, but rather is seen as an object, detached and gazed upon with an extractive orientation, one of mastery and control. We control nature. Rather than live in nature, nature is outside us, an object we can use. The objectification of the relations between human beings themselves follows from this, that we then start to master and control others rather than live with. So Gandhi seeks to shape an Indianized version of the non-violent socialism, consistent with what is claimed to be Marx's basic principle of communism, according to Chakrabarti and Da, right? They say, to each according to their need, from each according to their capacity. Right? This is the idea of socialism. If you can contribute to society, you do something. If you need, you get it. That means that the surplus production of a society is used to upkeep everyone, including those who cannot contribute. But the expectation is that if you can contribute, you do. For example, who are the ones who cannot contribute? The very old and the very young. Think of what we've said about mothers, for example, and their children and training, their contribution of unpaid labour to maintain those who are helpless. I want to talk about dialectics in Marx and Gandhi. The point is to learn something from Gandhi so as to renew and reclaim scholarship and understanding of Marx, right? And vice versa. I think by looking at these concepts, we learn a way of thinking about Gandhi because we're thinking about him in relation to Marx, and a way of thinking about Marx that's new because we're thinking of him in relation to Gandhi. Marx, of course, is the most influential social scientist there's ever been. I've said this many times. But he did not remain stuck in earlier positions or analysis. And we see that in the letters. If we read the letters as a diary of his ongoing thinking, it's really clear that he is reflecting and changing his position all through his life. Marx went back to the library after each engagement with political action. After 1848, the 1848 revolutions, right, he wrote the manifesto in 1847. Right, it said, a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And just a few months after that, there was an uprising. All right, when he said a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, there weren't that many communists, actually, only a few. So this spectre was a very small spectre. But there was a working class uprising in July of 1848 in France. It was massively defeated. And so instead of his expectation that the revolution was nigh, Marx had to go back to the library to try and think through what they had got. They got so much right, but what had they got wrong? So the manifesto from the very early time was thought of something that they had to rewrite, or that was wrong in some way. And then again, because in 1857 there was a financial crisis, especially in Germany. Marx is very alert to Germany, where he's from, right? They, Marx and Engels, by their analysis, had expected that a financial crisis meant a political crisis, an uprising. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen as expected. So Marx goes back to the library to try and work out, well, what is going on with economics? I mean, there was an uprising, what Marx actually identifies later, but I think he wasn't self-conscious enough at that stage to recognize that the uprising just didn't happen in Europe because Europe was so invested in colonialism. The uprising happened in India. The mutiny, the so-called mutiny, what the English call the mutiny, was the first all-India revolution, 1858, a little bit later, but still in the colonial sphere. And that was the cycle of uprising and following economic crisis. But Marx by this time is back in the library. So he's continually getting involved in political struggles and then interrupting them and going back to the library to work out why his analysis was not quite right. He writes the Grundrisse, and then following the Civil War in America, rewrites again. Because he's paying attention to Lincoln, he writes to Lincoln, Lincoln's secretary writes back. He writes a letter on behalf of the International Working Men's Association to Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, right? And Abraham Lincoln's secretary writes back. Marx says Abraham Lincoln is the hope of the working class in the Americas. Now, we wouldn't always think that, but certainly over against the slave-owning class, for sure, the industrial North was the progressive side. Now, both, of course, wanted to occupy all of the West, right? And the battle of the Civil War, American Civil War, was really over what would be the economic system for the whole of the United States as the United States was expanding westward, taking over all that Indian land. And it was a battle between using the whole of the west of America as plantation for a slave economy, expanded, or for a labor-based industrial economy. It was Lincoln that won. Okay, the slaves were freed. Well, of course, they were soon found other ways to contain Black America. You can read Du Bois on Black Reconstruction. What happened 10 years after the Civil War was basically a rightward lockdown on the freedoms that had been given or had been taken by Black America. Anyway, Marx goes back to the library and he writes Capital after the Civil War. All through the text of Capital, you can find references both to the Indian uprising and to the American Civil War. That's sort of the background context of his thinking through of economics. But even then, he publishes Capital in 1867. And in 1871, there is the uprising of the Paris Commune, which is also defeated. And Marx rewrites Capital yet again in 1873 for the French workers. He's continually changing and refining his text. And we can see that if we look in his diary, in his letters. We can see the thought process of him changing his way of working. Why he needed to rewrite Capital for the French working class. They'd risen up. He supported the uprising, not in advance, but after it happened, he thought, now's the wrong time. But once it happened, he supported very strongly. And in fact, for the next few years, looked after refugees from France in his house in London. That's a dialectical model. Gandhi too was pleased to change his views. He is even pleased to report that he is changing his views. He makes no hobgoblin of consistency. I love that he uses the word hobgoblin because the first translation of the manifesto, the English manifesto, was not that a spectre is haunting Europe in English, probably the one that Gandhi would have read. It said a hobgoblin was haunting Europe. That was the first English translation of the manifesto. Ein Gespenst geht in Europa. I don't have evidence that Gandhi had read that except for this quote, but he makes no hobgoblin of consistency. He says, if I am true to myself from moment to moment, I do not mind at all the inconsistency that may be flung in my face. Marx too, he would say, if he was charged with getting things wrong, he would get out of it by a little dialectics. A thinker called Bipin Chandra has named a Gandhian strategy, struggled, truce, struggle. Right, that's the strategy. Fight with the British, then negotiate, compromise, then fight again. The strategy of non-violence, the Satyagrahis, right, were supposed to put themselves in the way of British aggression, but never to fight back. And the strategy of non-violence and struggle, true struggle, was adopted not because it was a bourgeois strategy, not at all, but because it was suited to a multi-class mass movement against the semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian, hegemonic British colonial state. Most important, Bipin Chandra now saw Gandhi as a brilliant leader of a popular movement who, far from being bourgeois and non-revolutionary, played a critical role in trying to ensure that the class adjustment that necessarily had to happen to any multi-class movement happened in India increasingly in favor of the oppressed. So there were many classes fighting in the Indian Revolution. Middle class, business class, workers, and the Harijans, the really poor. It was a multi-class rebellion, but Gandhi was on the side of the lowest part of that alliance. And he did his work to try and bring everyone to consciousness together. This is the idea of why critical thinking is important, because you're continually trying to see what is the position that will be liberation for all, not just a position of liberation for yourself. Marx's famous line is about a coat, right? There's another place in which Gandhi and Marx are similar in some sense. A coat equals 20 yards of cloth. I want to change that cloth to khadi cloth because Gandhi was the advocate of spinning Indian cloth, right? I should have worn my khadi outfit. Khadi was homespun cloth, right? And you see in the stamps that I've collected, been using for images here, there's a stamp, the famous scene of Gandhi weaving on a chakra, hand spun cloth. All through Capital, Marx is talking about this example of how a cloth is made by weavers, by tailors, the making of a coat, 20 yards of linen transformed into a coat, and that changes value. Why was he using a coat, weavers and tailors, as his example of Capital? Right? Partly because that was the big industry of the time, but also because it was cotton and cloth that was being sold to India and destroying the weaving of the Indian masses. So the famous photographs of Gandhi seated at his chakra spinning, an image that's reproduced on money, on stamps, on commemorative cups, is a symbolic point of resonance. And you can see that moment of Gandhi spinning as almost iconic as Marx getting a haircut when he wrote to Engels on that same day that he discarded the heavy rhinoceros coat that he was like always wearing. His coat is a model of critical thinking because it's so important for the logic of Capital. Right? The first political engagements that Marx had in Trier, where he lived, where he became a journalist first of all, were his writings about the Silesian area near him, about the weavers of Silesia and their struggle for adequate conditions against the new industrial machinery. All through his life, Marx was concerned with what was happening with weavers and the introduction of new technological means that displaced the weavers from their occupation and exploited them. Gandhi's first entry into politics in India after returning from South Africa was an intervention into the issues of farmers of Champaran in Bihar who were forced by indigo planters to grow indigo, right? And indigo is used to dye blue jeans. Any of you wearing blue jeans, those jeans are dyed with indigo. That originally was the main crop of colonial India. The British colonists in India, well, there were two crops, opium and indigo. Opium tukki, tukfin. Marx's interest in weavers also features all through Capital, where even the British Governor-General, he quotes from the Times, lamenting that the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching in the plains of Bihar. The student of technologies of textiles, if we're students, if we think critically about that history, we should start with weaving. It would not be frivolous to consider Marx's study of the impact of the sewing machine on domestic labour. When Gandhi writes of the sewing machine, he makes two interesting associations. First of all, he's thinking of the effort to introduce homespun cotton. And the second reference is to the writing machine. So he links the sewing machine to the writing machine, the typewriter. I know there are friends who laugh at this attempt to revive this great art of handspun, right? His chakra. This in the clip here. Where is it there? That one. I know there are friends that laugh at this attempt to reintroduce the great art of spinning, handspun. They remind me that in these days of big mills, sewing machines, and typewriters, only a lunatic can hope to succeed in reviving the rusticated spinning wheel. These friends forget that the needle has not yet given place to the sewing machine, nor has the hand lost its cunning in spite of the typewriter. Well, here's a question for us. Does technology remove our skills of handwriting and their importance See, I think in the letter writing and in the diary writing, where Gandhi and Marx are not using a typewriter, they are thinking in a different way than you might for publication. And I think that still applies for us. A question to ask ourselves is, do we think differently when we handwrite, when we write notes? Right? Is that a more open and free kind of thinking? When you try and write on a screen, you're writing for someone else other than yourself. You're writing for a publication, you're writing for an essay, you're writing to please someone. We need to not be writing to please someone. Well, you know, you have to please. The problem with writing for publication or writing for an essay is exactly this alienation. You're writing for someone else. But a really good form of, or a critical form of thinking is one where you don't have to obey that stricture. 10 years later, in 1929, Gandhi applauds the labour-saving device of the sewing machine, the Singer Company sewing machine. He said, you know, it's great. It was invented by Mr. Singer out of a love for, you know, after seeing his wife slaving to sew up his socks with a needle and thread. Now, does that invention then imply factory and exploitation? Gandhi then says, yeah, but I'm a socialist. I'm socialist enough to say that factories should be nationalized, state-controlled, not for profit, but for the benefits of humanity. Love taking the place of greed as the motive. It's an alteration in the conditions of labour that I want. The mad rush for wealth must cease. This is exactly the position of Marx. Marx is for the nationalisation of labour and for the use of the profit that comes from the nationalisation of the factories to keep up those who are in need, for the upkeep of all. The sewing machine is key to how Marx gets into the costs of the reproduction of the family, where there are those who are needy, who are kept by labour that is really not paid, the labour of housewives, that should be. On the oppressed, topic of the oppressed, Iqbal Ahmed, the great writer, reports the obvious. They focused our attention on the poor and the working class. That was Gandhi and Marx in a nutshell. As Chandra pointed out, Gandhi's role in bringing the popular movement in favour of the oppressed was key to his politics. Gandhiji's emphasis on working among the masses and especially the untouchables, the Harijans, children of God, he said, in a period when no one else had come round to taking up their cause, the cause of these sections. The Gandhian nationalists, in their own way, initiated and kept up a resistance that focused on the poorest of the poor. If I think of comparative research, there's so many topics. On unemployment, Marx's Capital lays the stress on the precarious labour of that floating and stagnant reserve army. On the village, Marx is always interested in communal ownership of land. His knowledge at first derived from philosophers, but later, increasingly from reading Maine, Lubbock, ethnographers, as well as the newspapers from Bengal Harakuru. On unity, consider what Gandhi offers in terms of Hindu-Muslim unity, All India unity, All India radio. This is not just a discussion of tolerance, but goes to the heart of what India will become, has become. On Gandhi statues being blindfolded in Gujarat, see the essay by Rao, it's poignant, given the way what's happened to the statues of Marx in Europe when Europe brought down those statues. On opium, Tuk Fin. In his 1844 discussion of Hegel, Marx said the criticism of religion is a prerequisite of all criticism, right? And we famously know, Marx said, religion is the opium of the people, right? But when he says religion is the opium of the people, this is much misunderstood. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, right? Religion is the opium of the people, but expand the quote and read what Marx said, and you can see this in the letters as well. He says, religious suffering is one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of the soulless condition is the opium of the people. So he's not saying, he's not against religion. It's not obviously against religion. He's saying religion is the alienated vehicle through which people express their oppression, their sense that they are oppressed, that they live in a heartless world. It's amazing how wrong people can get a sentence of Marx when you lift it up out of its context. To think Marx says religion is the opium of people means that he is against religion. I mean, he is to a degree against religion. He says, no, don't go for religion, go for revolution. But religion and revolution are on the same side. They are not opposed. It's really important to recognize this. And Gandhi recognizes too. Gandhi was not wholly dissimilar on a track when in Hind Swaraj, his 1909 text, he castigates the comprador class, the class that works with the British, using an analogy with cannabis. He writes, who assisted the company officers? Who was tempted at the sight of their silver? Who bought their goods? History testified that we all did this. In order to become rich all at once, we welcomed the company officers with open arms. We assisted them. If I'm in the habit of drinking bhang, which is marijuana, right? Hashish drink, and the seller thereof sells it to me, am I to blame or him? At one point, Gandhi says of addiction, and of course Gandhi was critical of those who were indirectly guilty of poisoning natives with liquor sold illicitly and stupefying Indian miners by selling them opium in contravention of the law. Now this is a position taken by Marx and taken by Ho Chi Minh as well. In Hind Swaraj, when Gandhi says of opium, an ignorant mother from the purest motives may administer a dose of opium to her child, her motives will not cure her of her ignorance, nor in the moral world purge her of her offence. Did Gandhi know that Marx had said something similar with regard to women who gave their children Godfrey's cordial, which was an opiate, to keep them quiet while they had to go to work? In the 1800s, in the 1840s, children were given opium in a tincture. It was called Godfrey's cordial, like a soft drink. And sometimes the opium was sunk to the bottom of that bottle. If you didn't shake it up, you could kill your child. High death rates followed the mortality of children from local causes, principally due to the employment of mothers away from their homes and the neglect and maltreatment arising from their absence, or the need to keep the children silent while the mother worked, dosing their children with Godfrey's cordial, often with tragic results. So Gandhi and Marx are following the same path. Again, Marx and Gandhi seem on the same page. Marx supports the Chinese resistance to the British in the Opium War, and even recommends that the emperor legalize the trade so as to undermine the East India Company. Gandhi laments the way the Chinese are enslaved to opium. You know, Ho Chi Minh also said that the use of opium by the French was one of the main reasons he wanted to find a solution to get rid of their oppressive activity. Yet the opiate also opens questions of self-awareness. Though it's very curious that Gandhi links this to an awareness of difference among Indians, and simultaneously the awareness needed to see how the gifts of colonialism are tainted. He says, it was after the advent of railways that we began to believe in distinctions. And you are at liberty now to say that it's through the railways we are beginning to abolish those distinctions. An opium eater may argue the advantage of opium eating from the fact that he began to understand the evil of the opium habit after having eaten it. I'd ask you to consider well what I've said on the railways. Right? So he's using the opium analogy in the same way that Marx is using the religion analogy. Religion is the opium of the people, railways are the opium of the people. So on railways, Marx and Gandhi share a sensitivity to this vast apparatus, right, of communication that was the railways. Across India, the British built railways, right? In a notorious early piece in the New York Daily Tribune that Marx was writing, as everyone knows, Marx wrote, modern industry resulting from the railway system will dissolve the hereditary divisions of labour upon which rest the Indian castes, those decisive impediments to Indian progress and Indian power. For Gandhi, on his part, the condemnation of the railways was resounding in Hind Swaraj, in his book Hind Swaraj. And yet he had to use them, as Sumit Sarkar writes, if modern transport networks enhance colonial power, their link with nationalist considerations against British domination is at least as evident. Despite his well-known strictures against the railways, it's difficult to imagine the countrywide reach attained by Gandhi without the most visible form of industrial modernity. Gandhi needed the railways to get to the people. Of course, Gandhi travelled by train. He also wrote books, despite contending that those who are intoxicated by modern civilization are not likely to write against it. The train stamp, I note. On violence, Gandhi is famous for non-violence, right? In Hind Swaraj, there are times when Gandhi sounds more like Mao Zedong. In his famous essay, It's Terrible or It's Fine, the first essay in the selected works of Mao, Volume 1, concerning the peasants' adventurism. Staging a fictional conversation between an editor and a reader, Gandhi mentions the Italian working classes' anger sympathetically. The working classes in that land are still unhappy. They therefore indulge in assassination, rising revolt and rebellion on their part is always expected. Gandhi scribbled the famous do or die message on a piece of paper, and a little later he wrote, either we will make India free or lay down our lives in the attempt to free her. In 1942, and he wrote The Cult of the Bomb in 1930. In the Mao text, It's Terrible or It's Fine, Mao is saying, we shouldn't judge the peasants. The peasants are oppressed and they have risen up against that oppression and killed their landlords. Who are we to say either that's terrible or that's fine? It just is. Now what we need to do is think of what this means for China as a whole. So I think Gandhi is doing something similar there. What's overlooked is that also Marx, like Gandhi, was able to, and indeed necessarily did, change his position in the face of events which provoked critical self-reflection. This is the heart of Experiments with Truth, Gandhi's autobiography, and the practice Marx set up from the 18th Brumaire onwards. On revising your work, Gayatri Spivak, in a lecture in Calcutta in 2018 on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth at a conference about that, referred to the 1872 reissue of the manifesto to emphasize the comment that the authors, Marx and Engels, had decided not to change the text, even though they said the second section on revolutionary strategy was now obsolete. However much that the state of things may have altered in the last 25 years, this is from the preface, the general principles laid down in the manifesto are on a whole as correct as ever. Here and there, some detail might be improved, but the practical application of the principles will depend, as the manifesto itself states, everywhere and at all times, on the historical conditions for the time being existing. And for that reason, no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of section 2. Marx and Engels even changed their mind from the manifesto. My conclusion for all of this, right, I'm still thinking about it. Critical thinking means you do your research, you explore these associations, and you consider what it means. Perhaps at the end, all we can add to Gandhiji's recommendation for daily writing of diary is daily reading of all kinds of texts, published, not published. I try to read everything, right? And which also should be an everyday practice of self-reflection and engagement. What we see from Marx is constant discussion of what others say, written in newspapers, in magazines, in the press, in Hansard. The Hansard is the record of the parliamentary discussion, in books and in letters. And he's continually writing about what other people write in his letters to Engels. Indeed, in the circulation of letters, you see a kind of cut and paste before the phrase, so to speak, a popular discourse. That a reader's ticket to the British Library was so highly prized when the coat was in hock, he couldn't attend, right? It's a lesson for us on the level of meditations and experiments with truth that required constant reading. For the present, and not only for India, such reading might have consequences, and we should welcome those. The written and writerly history of the encounter between Gandhi and Marx renews the production of an immense accumulation of documents relevant to where we are today. The elementary task is to sift and sort so as to learn and reflect on new ways we think we might right the wrongs of the world. That is perhaps how we could see their texts. We could see in their texts our own reflection on our own present. And we see it in these great thinker-actors of the past. In all likelihood, the task is beyond any of us, any one of us. But the illustrations on offer are then so many and so profound and so moving along all the time. And no single text can represent this effort. Really? We better have a break because you've got a phone call. Okay.